The rift between Qatar and countries led by Saudi Arabia is described by some media as the worst rift to lift the Gulf since the formation of the Gulf Cooperation Council in 1981. What is the immediate fallout from this ban, and how could it develop?
I think it is true. This is the biggest rift that the GCC has faced since its foundation. While there have been ripples in Qatar's relations with Bahrain, with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, it has never really got this bad, through which Qatar is squeezed on all fronts, it seems, for its domestic and foreign policies. It is being pressed to basically surrender what is essentially a rather independent foreign policy, and be asked to fall into line with this emerging agenda of Saudi-led counterterrorism, to line up against Iran, but also to limit Qatar's autonomy in terms of its actions in the region. Where this can go, of course, is anybody's guess. As you know, today the Kuwaiti Emir, yesterday the Omani leadership were trying to intervene to try and bridge the gap between the two parties. And Qatar at the moment is holding its powder precisely because it is hoping that this issue can be resolved peacefully, quickly and diplomatically. And in the meanwhile, though, as you've seen, President Trump has tweeted saying that fingers were pointing to Qatar when the question of terrorism had come up in Riyadh just recently. And so we don't quite know exactly how this one is going to be resolved. But the impact you already see in Doha in terms of food, in terms of access to water, and reports that some people are beginning to withdraw their hard currency out of the country. Highly damaging developments in terms of Qatar's national economy.
And Professor Ehteshami, you earlier said the current flare-up in tensions is just a slow-burning fuse that has been burning for a long time in the background. So talk to us about the backdrop of all this. I mean, what are the reasons that they're not mentioning?
You're right. This has been a slow-burning fuse. It started, I suspect, when the current Emir Tamim's father took control of the reins of power in Qatar way back in 1995, when he unseated his own father while he was abroad on a trip. And after 1995, Sheikh Hamad began to chart a new path for Qatar, the first element of which was distance between itself and Saudi Arabia, that it wanted to come out of the shadow of Saudi Arabia. To do that, the Qataris needed to develop a whole new persona, and that was to redefine the relationship with the international community, to refocus their efforts on becoming a major LNG, the natural gas producer and exporter, but also to begin to draw independently of Saudi Arabia closer to the United States, which they've managed to do successfully. And the fourth leg of this strategy was to put in practice this policy of independent, autonomous relations with the neighborhood through the exercise of soft power. And that was Al Jazeera, with which I'm sure your viewers are very familiar, as it was then a very independent, new, fresh perspective that provided insights right across the Arab world and also internationally on how the region saw itself and how international news was broadcast in the region. Highly revolutionary steps as far as the region was concerned from 1995 onwards. In 2013, Sheikh Hamad, unprecedented in the region, decided to abdicate and pass the reins of power to his son, Sheikh Tamim, the current emir, without any interference, and enabled the young emir to begin to recast, if you like, Qatar's relations with the region. That happened, unfortunately, at the time that the Arab world was going through the combustions of revolution. The Arab Spring had already started in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia. Civil war was on the way in Syria and in Yemen. And that has made Qatar's relations with the region, but also this crafting of its independent foreign policy, much, much harder to articulate. And it is bringing of these crises, compounded by softening oil and gas prices, which is now leaving Qatar exposed. And all of this came to a head at the American Arab so-called Islamic Summit in Riyadh just last week, during which President Trump has now created what seems to be a coalition of Sunni Arab countries against radicalization, against terrorism, and ultimately also against Iran. Qatar finds itself really bereft of allies amongst that group, and also a challenge for its foreign policy to be able to maintain relations with Islamist groups. Many of them are peaceful, but it has had links with less peace-seeking states, but also to maintain these relations of independence of action in relation to foreign policy towards Iran, towards Turkey, and towards Israel. All of these are now being challenged by this coalition that the Saudis and the Americans have now put together.
So lots of revolutionary steps, and actually some of the traditional monarchies actually see Qatar as a threat for the position it's taken on modernization and the broadcasts even on Al Jazeera that you mentioned. Professor Ehteshami, Mr. Marashi, I'm afraid we have lost connection with him, so I'm going to stick with you on this one. So Qatar is accused of supporting terrorism, especially for its alleged support of the Muslim Brotherhood, a nearly 100-year-old Islamist group. But Qatar has rejected these allegations, calling these accusations unjustified and baseless. Is there any substance to this allegation?
To be perfectly frank with you, not really, because the Brotherhood, as you say, is one of the oldest political movements in the Muslim world, in the Middle East in particular. And between 2011 and 2013, was actually elected to power in Egypt. All right, it wasn't in the best government that Egypt had had, but nevertheless, it was elected to that position through the will of the people in Egypt. And it has a presence, substantial political, social presence in neighboring countries, in Jordan, in Palestine, in Tunisia, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq, and elsewhere. You can't just wipe a movement of that kind of depth out on the pretext of that it's a terrorist organization because General Sisi of Egypt calls them terrorists, or because the Emiratis feel threatened by the Brotherhood's alleged emerging agenda. The Brotherhood has not used arms for its position since being removed of power in Egypt in 2013, and also its forces, the ones lined up in Qatar, are the core of the mainstream Brotherhood. Frankly, if it wasn't for Qatar to maintain dialogue with the Brotherhood would go underground and become much more of a militant organization than it is today.
And there's much contradiction in this. I mean, with regards to Iran, the alleged comment by Qatari Emir indicates he hailed Iran as an Islamic power and criticized Donald Trump and his policy on Tehran creating ripples in the Gulf countries. And these alleged comments came at a time when Saudi Arabia, with its Gulf powers, have joined forces with the U.S. to contain and counter Iran's regional influence. And ironically, there's a very large American airbase inside Qatar, which is used in the fight against Islamic fundamentalists in the region. So how do you see these contradictions playing out? What will the U.S. Pick a side? Will the U.S. be forced into relocating its airbase?
I would say, in fact, this is the worst case scenario if I was sitting in Washington, where there is me trying to put a coalition of powerful, wealthy, pro-Western Arab states together to confront Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, radicalism, Iran, whatever you want to line up against that coalition. And then you then begin to see at the very heart of this coalition a rift between two of its core members, both of which are actually close American allies. So for the US to have to choose a side is a real problem, because if, for example, it begins to move its airbase, the biggest in the Middle East, there are about 11,500 American personnel in Qatar right now. If they move El Udeid base from there to Emirates, for example, it would have major consequences for Qatari security and foreign policy. But also through such an act, the US will be showing its hand in terms of picking and choosing alliances. That, in my view, will actually destroy the GCC as an organization that we talked about at the very beginning, because Qatar will find that it has no place in an organization which is diminishing its role as an equal member. So it puts the GCC at the crossfire, but it makes America's decision-making that bit harder, because it cannot, within this small coalition of Arab monarchies, pick and choose. It needs to keep these countries united, it needs to give them a common purpose, and it needs to make sure that they don't fight against each other for the greater purpose of fighting terrorism. And yet right now what we're seeing is this rift beginning to open up, And as President Trump has tweeted, that tweet is going to create new ripples of tension across the GCC countries.
And with all these developments, does it feel like Iran is enjoying this, diplomatic punch, if you will? Will this just push Qatar closer to Iran?
Isn't that irony of ironies, as you say? Barely a week ago, Iran had the finger of the Sunni world pointing at it for its regional behavior, for supporting Hezbollah, for opposing the peace process, for keeping the Bashar Assad in power, a whole range for supporting the Houthis in Yemen and so on. And it felt really isolated, even though it has had one of its most successful presidential elections to date. Barely a few days before this summit was taking place. And the Arab world, for all intents and purposes, appeared united against Iranian hegemony, Iranian expansionism, and so on. And yet here we are, where Iranians are now announcing that if Saudi Arabia and the UAE block food exports to Qatar, Iran will get food supplies to them within 12 hours, that if airspace of Saudi Arabia is closed off to Qatar, Iran will open up its own airspace to Qatar, and that if Iran can do anything to enhance Qatar's security, is prepared to do it. And Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, has tweeted saying issues with our neighbors should be resolved through dialogue. It is supremely ironic that Iran is now counseling dialogue amongst the countries that should be united against it.
What do you think will be the ultimate result? I mean, Qatar is in a vulnerable position. I mean, the old land border it has is with Saudi Arabia. It is rich in oil and gas, yes, but it imports most of its food, so it's bound to be in a weak position. Do you think in the future coercion will work?
I think its vulnerabilities are even greater than that, of course, because Bahrain and UAE sit on the other side of it, maritime as well. And if they're going to block off air and sea access to Qatar, then Qatar will have much harder work to do in terms of maintaining its global networks and so on. But, it's a month of Ramadan where Muslims are fasting, are with their families, and by and large, turning towards, if you like, more aspirational, extra-human issues. And Qataris will be feeling the unbrotherly, if you like, nature of this act, where at the height of Ramadan, to be threatened with deprivation of food and water and so on, will not sit well with the Qatari people. But they will in turn expect their own government not only to take a stance against Saudi Arabia and others, but also, more importantly even, to ensure stability and security of their populations. So Qatar will have very tough choices to make. I don't think Qatar can walk away from Saudi Arabia and Emirates and Bahrain, because ultimately these are its brother countries. It cannot form an alliance with Iran, because that would push Qatar way, way out on a limb in a place that I don't think it is comfortable in being. So the best that Qatar can hope for is for the other members of the GCC, namely Kuwait and Oman, to try and bang heads and try and begin these warring parties together around a consensus. The consensus, though, is going to be very difficult to achieve, because it's now public knowledge that Qatar has to sever links with Muslim Brotherhood, that Qatar has to limit all its support with various anti-Syrian government organizations, that it has to sever its links with Iran, and that it has to behave in a way that Saudi Arabia would regard as normal.
All right, thank you very much for your insights, Professor Ehteshami, joining us from Durham University in the UK.